my favourite book from my childhood by my favourite author from my childhood is Lola Rose. Jacqueline Wilson's Lola Rose will always be my favourite of her books because it brings back so many memories. I read it so many times, and I have this very vivid memory of a short story that I wrote maybe about the age of 10 or 11 that was very much inspired by this book. It will always hold a special place in my heart. This was actually released in 2003, and I think it was one of her first books that I read around the time of release. And I have to say the cover design for this it's ingrained in my memory, but I love it with the pink Lola Rose writing and the slightly embossed detailing. Absolutely adore it. But obviously, it's not just style over substance. The substance here is amazing. So I'll read the description from Amazon, but I'm going to not spoil any of the actual plot intricacies for you. And the description is as follows. When life with Janie's violent-tempered father becomes too frightening to cope with, Janie, her mum, and her little brother Kenny are forced to escape in the middle of the night. Slipping out of the house unseen, travelling up to London by train and checking into a hotel, it's almost like playing an elaborate game. They even make up false identities to protect their secret, and Janie becomes the glamorous-sounding Lola Rose. But when the money runs out and reality bites, what will they do next? It's quite an intense narrative, and I also have to say it's one of Jacqueline Wilson's longest books at the time. And the age range for this one is perhaps not as clear as it is for some of her other ones, because on the one hand, it's not kind of as grown up as, say, Love Lessons, but it's obviously not as juvenile as things like Sleepovers. So I'd say it's probably a 7 to 12 thing. I read it when I was about, I guess it would have been 11 if it came out in 2003. And I think that I was just mature enough for it. Because if it's dealing with domestic violence, it's pretty tough. But I think it handles the subject, the narrative, very well. Certainly from a child's perspective. It goes into enough detail to know that her father's violent behaviour is having a very negative impact on her mother. Both physically, of course, and emotionally. But obviously the main focus is Janie, or Lola Rose. When they're on the run, it is quite intense. You do, as a reader, feel like they're looking over their shoulder all of the time. It is quite, I'd say, one of Jacqueline Wilson's most scary novels. That's not to say it's scary, it's not a horror story, it's not a thriller, but it's certainly her most moving and emotive, certainly at this point in her writing. There may be, I think, a couple since then that I would say are probably slightly more intense. But you do feel like you're constantly looking over your shoulder. What actually makes this, because it sounds very serious and it sounds like it could be more of a much more grown-up, a teenage book rather than a preteen book. But what makes it quite juvenile is actually one of the things I loved about it. And it's the scratch card and what they do with the scratch card. And all I have to say is this is a little time capsule for noughties fashion, because Lola Rose gets a denim jacket with pink fur around the collar, and they were so in fashion at the time, and I desperately wanted one, and I never got one. But denim jackets with pink fur around the collar were the thing to have, and that aspect of it where she's dreaming of all the things to buy and all these material things, it kind of reminds me of Tracy Beaker. If you've read Tracy Beaker, you'll know, of course, when she's writing in her diary that she often, or I guess in the Dare game, she often dreams about these things and lists material possessions, or she'd go to Woolworths and buy this, 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 and this. And it's kind of that list style, that materialistic list, that makes it a little bit more juvenile than it could be. So I think actually the age range is reasonable, but certainly it's still quite intense, and obviously, unfortunately, it's something that a lot of young children do have to deal with. There are more than there should be in terms of families on the run, running from one parent, children who are facing violent homes, and if nothing else, it'll help them feel like they're not alone. It can be a conversation starter if a child is living in a violent home and they don't know how to tell anybody. I think it's a very, very solid book. As I said, I will always love it. I will always have a huge space in my heart for Lola Rose. I think Lola Rose is the book that confirmed in my mind I wanted to be an author. And I am. That's what I am now. And I think it's Lola Rose. Having read it several times, inspired short stories, I think it's this book that made my mind up about one. Not that I could ever have been anything else. I have no skills other than writing, but it's amazing. It's done so much for me. This book probably changed my life. If you're a fan of Jacqueline Wilson and haven't read it, please make it the next Jacqueline Wilson book that you read. You will not be disappointed. If you've never read any of Jacqueline Wilson books and you'd like to, this is a pretty decent one to start with. But as I said, it is a bit more intense than a lot of her others. So don't expect this level of seriousness a lot of the time. It is definitely one of the darker ones. But it's beautiful. I love it. I owe so much to it and so much to Jacqueline Wilson, and I'm getting slightly emotional. Lola Rose is everything.